What if the first real clues about the Red Bull Ford power unit weren't revealed on purpose, but slipped out because they were impossible to hide any longer? According to sources close to the project, early technical details of the 2026 engine have begun circulating quietly inside the paddock. Not headline figures, not marketing claims. The kind of details that only matter if you already understand where the regulations can bend. The reaction from rival teams hasn't been excitement. It's been alarm. Because these leaked elements suggest Red Bull may have focused on a priority most others underestimated, one that reshapes how performance is delivered, not just how much exists. And here's the part that makes this impossible to ignore. Once you understand why these specific details leaking now is such a problem, you start to realize this isn't just an engine story. It's the first quiet sign of how the next era of Formula One might already be tilting, and why paying attention early could change how you see everything that follows. Once those first details surfaced, the immediate reaction across the grid wasn't curiosity. It was recalibration. Because the information that leaked wasn't about peak horsepower or top-end figures. It pointed to how the Red Bull Ford power unit behaves across a lap. Energy deployment profiles. Recovery consistency. Thermal stability under sustained load. These are not headline metrics, but they are the foundations that decide whether a car can be pushed repeatedly without falling apart. That's why engineers who saw fragments of this data stopped talking and started rethinking their own assumptions. What makes these details so unsettling is that they suggest a power unit designed around usability rather than extremity. Instead of chasing maximum output in narrow windows, Red Bull appears to have prioritized stability across multiple operating states. Different energy modes. Different race phases. Different levels of degradation. That kind of versatility is far harder to achieve than a single big number. And once achieved, it allows the entire car concept to relax. Less protection. Less compromise. More freedom everywhere else. There's a reason this approach worries rivals more than outright speed. A stable power unit gives aerodynamicists confidence. It gives strategists options. It gives drivers trust. If the engine behaves predictably regardless of how aggressively it's being used, the car can be designed closer to the limit without constant safety margins. That's how small advantages become systemic ones. Not loud. Not obvious. But relentless over time. Another detail buried in the leak involves how the Red Bull Ford unit manages electrical energy late in a stint. Early indicators suggest far less drop-off than expected as conditions deteriorate. That has huge implications. Late race defense. Overtake protection. Consistent lap times when others fade. These are race-defining traits, not qualifying tricks. And they are exactly the kind of strengths that don't attract attention until championships quietly drift out of reach. Inside the paddock, there's also concern about how early this clarity appears to have arrived. Most manufacturers are still juggling trade-offs. Weight versus cooling. Deployment versus reliability. Performance versus longevity. The leaked details suggest Red Bull may have resolved several of those conflicts simultaneously, or at least narrowed them enough to commit decisively. Early commitment under a cost cap is priceless. It allows refinement instead of reinvention. And refinement always beats desperation in the long run. The Ford element adds another layer of intrigue. This isn't a junior partner learning the sport. It's a manufacturer with deep hybrid expertise, applying it to a clean sheet regulation set with no legacy constraints. The leaked details hint at a philosophy driven as much by road car logic as racing instinct. Efficiency. Repeatability. Control. Those values don't create spectacular one-lap stories. They create seasons that feel inevitable once they start unfolding. And this is why the story remains deliberately incomplete. Because these are only the first details. They don't describe the full picture. They don't explain how aggressive Red Bull will ultimately be. But they do reveal intent. They show what problems Red Bull chose to solve first, and which ones they were willing to ignore. And in Formula One, the order in which you solve problems often matters more than the solutions themselves. By the time the rest of the grid realizes which questions truly mattered, the answers may already be locked into the very core of the Red Bull Ford power unit. As teams dig deeper into what these leaked details actually imply, the concern starts to shift from surprise to inevitability. Because nothing in the information suggests improvisation. It suggests sequence. A power unit architecture that was designed with a very clear order of priorities, where trade-offs were accepted early instead of postponed. That matters because in 2026, postponing decisions is usually fatal. Every unresolved compromise bleeds into the rest of the car. The Red Bull Ford unit, at least on paper, appears to have removed several of those bleed points before others even identified them clearly. One of the most striking elements is how conservative the leaked figures actually look at first glance. There's no single metric that jumps off the page. No extreme voltage targets. No aggressive peak deployment curves. And that's exactly why experienced engineers are uneasy. Because conservative numbers that remain consistent across multiple scenarios are far more valuable than optimistic ones that collapse under stress. This suggests a power unit designed to operate comfortably below its absolute ceiling, leaving margin that can be exploited strategically rather than desperately. That margin is where races are won under a cost cap. If the baseline is stable, development becomes additive instead of corrective. You don't spend resources fixing fundamental behavior. You spend them sharpening edges. Rivals fear that Red Bull may already be operating in that phase while others are still trying to stabilize their foundations. And once teams diverge at that level, convergence becomes almost impossible without a regulation shock. Another subtle implication of the leak is how tightly the power unit appears to integrate with vehicle dynamics. The data hints that energy deployment is being shaped not just around efficiency, but around balance shifts mid-corner and on exit. That's a level of integration that blurs the line between engine and chassis. It allows the power unit to support grip rather than disrupt it. If true, it means Red Bull didn't design an engine and then fit it into a car. They designed a system where the engine actively participates in how the car behaves. This is where Max Verstappen's name inevitably enters the conversation. A power unit that delivers energy smoothly and predictably amplifies his greatest strength. Commitment. He thrives when the car does exactly what he expects, even if that expectation is aggressive. The leaked details suggest a unit that reduces hesitation points. Fewer moments where the driver has to wait, correct, or protect. That doesn't show up as raw power, but it shows up in relentless pressure, lap after lap, stint after stint. Politically, this puts the FIA in a familiar but uncomfortable position. There is nothing explicitly questionable in what has leaked. Everything aligns with the written regulations. But the intent of those regulations was to compress the field, not allow one interpretation to quietly separate early. For now, there's no justification for intervention. But the awareness is there. And awareness alone can change how future clarifications are framed, even if no one admits it publicly. And this is why these first leaked details matter far more than they seem. They don't prove dominance. They don't confirm an unbeatable advantage. What they do reveal is direction. They show what Red Bull and Ford chose to optimize first, and what they were willing to leave for later. In Formula One, that sequence often decides everything. By the time the rest of the grid realizes which priorities truly mattered, the answers aren't adjustable anymore. They're already cast into the architecture of the power unit itself, quietly shaping the next era long before the first race ever begins. As these early details continue to circulate, another layer of concern starts to dominate conversations inside rival factories. Because the leaked information doesn't just describe what Red Bull and Ford are doing. It hints at how long they've been doing it. Several elements point to decisions that would have had to be locked in very early, before most manufacturers were comfortable committing. That implies confidence at a stage where uncertainty was still supposed to be universal. And in Formula One, early confidence isn't optimism. It's usually preparation disguised as patience. What unsettles engineers most is how coherent the leaked architecture appears across disciplines. Electrical systems, thermal management, and deployment logic don't look like parallel developments. They look like a single conversation that's been ongoing for years. That kind of coherence can't be manufactured quickly, especially under cost cap restrictions. It suggests Red Bull and Ford weren't reacting to the regulations. They were interpreting them with a long-term philosophy already in mind. And once a philosophy hardens, it becomes very difficult for rivals to attack it from the outside. There's also growing attention on what isn't present in the leaked details. No signs of aggressive overclocking. No reliance on narrow performance windows. No extreme cooling demands that force aerodynamic compromises. That absence is telling. It suggests a power unit that doesn't need to be protected by the car. Instead, the car can be built freely around it. That inversion of dependency is rare, and when it happens, it changes how the entire vehicle behaves over a season. Another subtle but worrying implication lies in development flexibility. A stable power unit gives teams the freedom to respond to problems elsewhere without triggering chain reactions. If aero updates fail, the engine doesn't become a liability. If weight targets slip, deployment doesn't collapse. That flexibility is what allows a team to absorb mistakes while continuing to move forward. Rivals fear that Red Bull may already have insulated itself against the kind of mid-season turbulence that derails most long-term projects. The Ford partnership adds weight to this interpretation. This isn't a supplier chasing relevance. It's a manufacturer entering with a clean slate and nothing to unlearn. The leaked details suggest Ford's influence is visible not in raw aggression, but in discipline. Repeatable outputs. Predictable degradation curves. Systems designed to behave the same way every time they're stressed. Those qualities don't generate hype. They generate control. And control is far more dangerous than spectacle in a regulation-limited era. Inside the paddock, this has led to a quiet shift in tone. The question is no longer whether Red Bull's Ford power unit will be competitive. It's whether it has already defined the reference point others will be forced to chase. That distinction matters. Chasing performance is one thing. Chasing architecture is another. One can be narrowed with upgrades. The other requires tearing down assumptions teams have already invested millions in protecting. And this is why the story refuses to conclude here. Because these are still only fragments. They don't confirm domination. They don't guarantee titles. But they do reveal intent, timing, and philosophy. And in Formula One, those are the ingredients that decide outcomes long before lap times ever do. If the first leaked details are this composed, the unanswered question isn't how fast the Red Bull Ford power unit will be. It's how much of the next era may already be shaped by decisions the rest of the grid can no longer change. As these fragments continue to circulate quietly, the final concern beginning to crystallize inside rival teams is not about speed at all. It's about inevitability. Because the leaked details suggest a power unit that doesn't rely on being perfect to be effective. It tolerates variance. It absorbs compromise. And that is the most dangerous characteristic any system can have under modern Formula One constraints. When a power unit continues to behave logically even when conditions drift away from ideal, it removes the natural self-correction that normally keeps the field compressed. What's especially unsettling is how this robustness changes long-term development dynamics. Teams usually expect early concepts to break in visible ways. Those failures force resets, rethinks, and late philosophical changes. The Red Bull Ford unit, based on what has leaked, doesn't appear to trigger those alarms. Instead, it invites incremental improvement. And incremental improvement, applied consistently under a cost cap, almost always outpaces radical correction. That's how gaps grow without anyone noticing the moment they became unbridgeable. There is also a strategic implication that extends beyond one season. A power unit that behaves predictably allows long-range planning. Race strategy, driver training, upgrade timing, even reliability trade-offs can be modeled with greater confidence. That gives Red Bull an advantage not just in execution, but in foresight. They can afford to think 3 races ahead while others are still reacting to the last one. Over a regulation cycle, that temporal advantage compounds just as powerfully as any technical one. Inside the FIA, this kind of leak raises questions that don't have immediate answers. Not because anything appears illegal, but because the regulations were designed to limit runaway convergence, not to accelerate it. If one interpretation proves so structurally sound that it becomes the default reference, the sport risks recreating familiar patterns under new technical language. That tension hasn't reached the public domain yet. But it's beginning to influence how future clarifications are discussed, even if no one is willing to say that out loud. Rivals also understand that once the first race arrives, perception will harden quickly. If Red Bull looks calm, composed, and consistent from the outset, the leaked details will be retroactively validated. Every strong stint will be interpreted as proof of deeper foundations. Every clean weekend will reinforce the belief that the architecture itself is doing the heavy lifting. At that point, chasing lap time becomes secondary to chasing belief. And belief is the hardest thing to recover once it's lost. The most dangerous part of this situation is that Red Bull doesn't need to be dominant immediately. They only need to be convincing. Convincing enough that rivals commit to defensive development paths. Convincing enough that questions stop being asked aggressively. Convincing enough that the narrative settles before the full potential of the power unit is even revealed. History shows that once that narrative forms, it becomes self-sustaining regardless of marginal gains elsewhere. And this is where the story deliberately remains open-ended. Because these first leaked details don't tell us how fast the Red Bull Ford power unit will be. They tell us how it thinks. They reveal a philosophy built around control, predictability, and early conviction. If that philosophy survives contact with real racing, it won't need to announce itself. It will simply shape the grid quietly, race after race. And by the time the full picture becomes obvious to everyone watching, the foundations revealed by this leak may already have decided far more than anyone was ready to admit.